All right, Bib 1001. Today we are going to talk about the Deuteronomic history and especially Joshua and Judges. At least I'm hoping we can get through all of that. And so I want to go ahead and sketch out the history for you. We did this a little bit last week, but want to sketch this out. And then I want us to think about who's writing this history, when is it written, who is it written for, and then we'll take a look at Joshua and Judges and see how it kind of speaks into that situation. And so you remember that this history, the Deuteronomic history, is told from the perspective of Deuteronomic theology. And so we have our Deuteronomic theology. And of course, that's about blessings and curses in response to loyalty. So key word, loyalty, blessings, and curses. And so this history is going to be told from this perspective of blessings and curses in response to loyalty to the covenant. And so we'll sketch our history out like this, and we'll unpack this more, but it's going to start roughly about 1240 with Joshua. And this is going to be where they enter into the land, they possess the land. And so main thing right now with Joshua, you're thinking entrance into the land. Then we're going to get the book of Judges. And then we're going to get 1st and 2nd Samuel. And in 1st and 2nd Samuel, this is where we meet Saul, the first king, and then David, the second king. And David's date is roughly 1010. I'll go ahead and mention him. And the key thing to keep in mind with David, and we'll look at this more closely later, but the key thing to keep in mind with David is that God promised him a dynasty. And so with David, we have the promise of a dynasty, or it may be helpful at this point to think in terms of throne. Okay, a dynasty, an everlasting kingdom, a throne that's going to be constant. Then, after David, roughly about 970, we are going to get Solomon. And Solomon, we're going to enter into 1st and 2nd Kings, which takes us clear to the end of the Deuteronomic history. Now, the thing you need to remember about Solomon is that he is the one who builds the temple, and God makes a promise about the temple that my name will be there. Okay, so right now we have basically 3 promises on the board. And so we have the promise of the land to Abraham. And so Joshua is leading them into the promised land, that land that God had promised way back there in Genesis 12, and had echoed that promise forward all across the pages of the OT. And so the promise of land. Then we get King David in 1010, and in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we read about God's promise to him, the promise of a dynasty, that you will never fail to have a son on the throne. And then Solomon comes after David, and Solomon is the one who builds the temple. And God promises that my name will be there. I'll watch over that place. It was a conditional promise that they had to be keeping covenant for God to watch over with blessing. But nonetheless, it was a promise that God would dwell there, reside amongst them, and God would respond to their prayers. So the temple. After Solomon, the kingdom splits. Splits for theological reasons, splits for political reasons, and we end up with a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is larger, and it's referred to as Israel because it has the majority of the tribes. The southern kingdom, that's where Jerusalem was at, that's where the temple was at. It's known as Judah because basically it was simply the tribe of Judah. And that's the tribe that David came from. So the line of David continues in the southern kingdom. Okay, this is where Jerusalem's at, this is where the temple is at, this is where David and his line ruled from. So the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, and as we saw last week, 722, conquered by Assyria. 587, conquered by Babylon. So Northern Kingdom continues to 722, and then they come under judgment, the Assyrians. Why? Because they're experiencing the curse of the covenant. They weren't staying loyal to the covenant, and so they come under that curse. They are conquered, they're expelled from the land. The southern kingdom continues until 587, and then their sins pile up. They've broken covenant so much that God finally brings ultimate covenant curse upon them. They are exiled to Babylon. Okay, they're expelled from the land. So way back here, the Exodus is when they're going out of Egypt towards the promised land. The exile is when they're kicked out of the promised land, expelled from the promised land, and taken to Babylon in captivity. Now, the fall of Jerusalem, the exile, roughly 587. Some will date it 586, 587, 586 in there. 2 Kings ends with the report of a king that was actually taken captive prior to this in about 598 being released in Babylon. If you want to turn with me to 2 Kings, it's chapter 25. I'll just read it for you, then we'll do some math. So 25, 27 in 2 Kings. And in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Now he was taken captive about 598, 597. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in that year he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king according to his daily needs as long as he lived. And that's how 2 Kings ends. So the thing I want to pick up on, at least at this point, is that 2 Kings has to be written after that date. Okay, so if he is taken captive roughly in 598, 597, right in here, and then 37 years after being taken captive, he is released. He never goes home, but he is released. He spends the rest of his days in Babylon. That means that 2 Kings is written somewhere after 561, 560. Okay, and so get the turn around there so you can see all the dates. And so 2 Kings is written sometime during the exile, sometime after Jehoiakim is released from prison. Okay, now where am I going with this? What I want you to think about is that this whole history from Joshua through 2 Kings, all of that is compiled in the midst of exile. Okay, and so they're trying to answer some pretty significant questions as they tell this history. They are trying to deal with the question, how did we get here? Why are we here? What happened that we went from the promised land to being captives in Babylon? Okay, and that's a big question. How is it that they got there in Babylon? And then the next question that comes with that is, okay, what do we do now that we're here? Is there any hope for us here? So think about what they've lost. Okay, so they have lost, and it helps me to kind of remember it by thinking in terms of T's. Okay, so one of the things that they lost was they lost the throne. Okay, so we'll kind of put it up here, losses. Oh, that show up? Yeah. Okay, so losses, things that they lost. So they lost the throne. They lost the temple. And to throw in one more T, they lost their terrain. Okay, these had all been promised to them from God. And so that there's no longer a king, there's no longer a Davidic king on the throne, there's no throne for a king to be on. The temple has been utterly destroyed. The Babylonians tore it down, burned it to the ground, tore it to the ground, shambles. And they've lost the promised land. They're no longer there in their own turf or their own terrain. They are in Babylon. And so not only are they trying to figure out, how did we get here, but what do we do now that we're here? And what happened to God? I mean, these were promises that God had made them. You'll never fail to have a son on the throne. My name will be there. I'll watch over this place. God promising the land to Abraham and determined to keep that covenant. And yet all those things are lost. And so if you're in Babylon and you're in captivity, you're having to wrestle with the question, what happened to our God? Was our God defeated? And that's why we're here? That the Babylonian gods proved superior to our God, and our God is a loser God, defeated God. And if that's the case, then they should start worshiping the gods of Babylon. And all the wars in the ancient world, all the wars had a religious component to them. And so whoever was victorious, it was because their God was stronger. And so it'd be very easy for them to go to Babylon and to see the temples of the gods and goddesses of Babylon, and to be sent the message that our gods are superior to your God. You should worship our gods. Your God is a defeated God. So, real question they're having to answer. What do we do? Was our God a loser? Did our God get defeated? And if so, then we should worship the gods of Babylon, the stronger gods, the more powerful gods. Another question that they might be wrestling with, not so much that our God was defeated, but did our God quit on us? Did our God bail out on us? Was our God not faithful? And so it's not so much that maybe our God was too weak as much as it is that our God didn't care. And so if our God doesn't care about us, why keep worshiping that God? Why not worship the gods of Babylon? At least they're successful. And it looks like they must have cared for their people. And so you're in Babylon. It's so tempting to just do as the Babylonians do and to worship their gods. Your God didn't care to save you. So this is a real kind of existential crisis for them, trying to figure out, what do we do? Why are we here? What happened to our God? And it would be tempting to, the Babylonians would uproot people, transport them to different places of the empire because they're trying to break down their culture, break down their identity. And so it'd be very easy to kind of lose a sense of your identity as a people and just try to blend in and make the best of it in Babylon and just kind of do as the Babylonians do and forget about your, kind of cultural uniqueness, especially when it comes to God. And so these were things that they were up against and things that they had to try to figure out. Do we have any other cause to maintain our identity? Is there any hope for us? Or do we simply blend in and become Babylonian and make the best of it? And as they're reflecting on these things, and as they're struggling with maintaining a sense of identity, or if they even should try, one of the things that they begin to reflect on, they still have. There's a T that they still have, Torah. They began to realize as they reflect on Torah that, Torah, instruction, the covenant, if you will, that as they reflect on this, they begin to realize, wait a minute, maybe our God has actually been faithful. Not faithful to save us, but faithful to the terms of the covenant. Because you'll remember that the terms of the covenant had to do with blessings and curses. And so there they are in captivity, and all of a sudden it begins to dawn on them. It's not that our God didn't care, and it's not that our God was defeated. Rather, our God was actually being faithful to the covenant. And our God was executing the curses of the covenant. And so all of a sudden, it's kind of strange, but all of a sudden that means hope for them. That if God is faithful to keep the covenant when it comes to the curses or disloyalty or disobedience, then maybe God will still be faithful to the covenant to bless if they start practicing loyalty. And so there becomes kind of a renewed emphasis while they're in exile in Babylon, a renewed emphasis on keeping covenant. That if they will keep covenant, if they will put the Lord first, if they will honor each other, if they will practice this loyalty, then maybe, just maybe, the God who is faithful to execute the curses will also be faithful to execute the blessings. And so there begins to arise new hope in the midst of exile, that there will be a return, that there will be a new son of David, that there will be a new temple, that God is going to bring them back to the land and restore them. We see this hope rise up in prophets like Ezekiel, Jeremiah. We see it in Isaiah. And maybe we're even seeing it there in 2 Kings, where it talks about the release of Jehoiakim from prison and how he's cared for. And maybe that becomes a hopeful sign that God is going to bring a total release from exile and a return. And so they'll receive the promised turf, the promised land back. There'll be a new throne of David established, a Messiah king, one anointed to rule, and that king will rebuild the temple, and it will be a time of renewal. And so there becomes this hope in the midst of exile, this renewal, if you will. So what do? They begin to reflect on their history through the lens of Torah. And so they go all the way back to how they entered the land and track it all the way through until the exile. And they begin to see this common theme that when they are faithful to God, they experience blessing. They experience victory. They experience good. But when they are unfaithful to God, when they disobey, when they rebel, when they transgress that covenant, Torah, then they come under curse. And so the whole history is told through that perspective. And in telling the history through that perspective, the historians or the theologians, or maybe they're prophets who are writing up this history, but as they tell the history to their own people, in that exiled generation, and they're rereading it, the constant message is our God wasn't defeated, that our God was actually being faithful to the covenant and executing the curses. But we see that God's faithfulness gives hope that if we actually start keeping covenant, then God will be faithful to execute blessings. So the history is told from that perspective, through that lens. Okay, so hope you're good with that. Again, if you're trying to put it all together, it's really helpful to think about the T's, okay, that they have the promised turf or terrain that was promised to Abraham, and Joshua leads them into the promised land. And then with David, you get the promised throne. You'll never fail to have a son on the throne, this dynasty. And then with Solomon, you have the temple and the promise that my name will be there. I'll watch over that place, and I will constantly give my attention to it. I'll be there. And so you have those promises. And then you have the covenant, okay, the Torah, and how they are to keep covenant. And if they keep it, blessing. If they break it, curse. They lose the promised land, the promised turf. They lose the temple, the promised temple. They lose the promised, temple, throne, and turf. They lose all three. But they still have Torah. And they discover that God has been faithful to keeping covenant. So maybe if they keep Torah, they'll experience the blessings of God. And they're able to live in hope, realizing that their God didn't abandon them, realizing that their God wasn't defeated, realizing that they have cause, if you will, to stay faithful to the Lord instead of just blend in with Babylonian culture and worship the gods of Babylon. Now, with all of that in view, we are now going to take a look at Joshua. So let me erase the board. I'll put this on pause for a moment and then get back. Okay, I've got a clean board, and we're going to keep working here and thinking about Joshua. And again, remember that Joshua is written for the exiles. Probably should put that up here real quick. So here we have Joshua, the book. And here's our timeline. So here are the exiles. Okay, and the thing I want you to begin to think about is not simply the events back here at 1240. Okay, so that's roughly when the book of Joshua takes place. The events of Joshua take place around 1240. Okay, but who's it written for? Who's it being told to? And so these stories are passed forward, passed forward, passed forward, and all the way up here, our date now is about 560. These stories are passed forward, some orally, some in writing. They're passed on from generation to generation after generation. And these theologians up here, or historians up here, as they pull all this stuff together, they're the ones who give shape to it, who give perspective to it. And so these, theologians slash historians slash prophets, they're writing up the stories of Joshua for the exiles to read. So as we work with Joshua and all the stories, all the books across here in this Deuteronomic history, we're not just thinking about the events of Joshua, but we're thinking about, why are these events being told to these people? What's the message to them? What's the news to them from these stories? Okay, so now let's go ahead and take a look at Joshua 1 through 9. And there's a couple things I want us to do with Joshua 1 through 9. One of them is to make a quick comparison between Joshua and Moses. So Joshua the person and Moses. And so Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, I'll give it a read here. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' servant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their forefathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Okay, so quickly, compare and contrast Moses and Joshua. So here we got Moses, here we got Joshua. Okay, and you're going to compare and contrast. Okay, so one of the things that we see is that they are both leaders. So that goes on both sides. They're both leaders of God's people. They're both called of God to lead the people. Moreover, we have the presence of God. So God present with both of them. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. We're going to find out that just as Moses led people across through the sea on dry ground, Joshua is going to lead them through the river on dry ground. So they both experience that. You can probably find a few other things where they're similar. Okay, but one big difference. Joshua doesn't really replace Moses when it comes to Torah. That only Torah comes through Moses. So Joshua is not going to receive new Torah, new commandments, new covenant from God. Instead, Joshua is told to do everything that Moses commanded. Everything that Moses commanded you are to do. And you are to focus on this book of the covenant. And you are to meditate on it. It's to be constantly on your lips. and you are not to depart from it to the right or to the left. Do everything Moses commanded, and you'll be successful. That every place you put your foot, it will be yours. The key to Joshua taking possession of the promised land is Torah, doing everything that Moses commanded. So Moses is the most authoritative figure in the whole Old Testament. His shadow reaches across all the pages of the Old Testament. Everybody is to do what God commanded through Moses. Okay, every leader after Moses is evaluated on the basis of how well did they listen to Moses? How well did they keep the covenant? How well did they do the Torah that Moses gave them? And so Joshua is charged to do everything that Moses commanded. In this sense, he doesn't take the place of Moses. He is rather to lead the people in keeping what Moses commanded. And if they do that, then they are going to experience success. They will take possession of the promised land. Okay, you got that? So we did our little comparison in terms of Joshua and Moses. God is with both of them to lead the people, but Torah came through Moses. Joshua is charged to obey, to keep Torah, and that will be the key to taking possession of the land. Now, question. Who's eavesdropping on this conversation in chapter 1 between Joshua and God? The exiles. Okay, so God is talking to Joshua, but who's listening in? Well, the story is being told, is written up for the exiles. And so what are the exiles hearing as God speaks to Joshua? They are hearing that the key to the possession of the land was not their military strength. The key to the possession of the land was listening to Moses, doing everything that God commanded through Moses, the Torah that God gave through Moses. So the exiles are beginning to think, maybe the key to going home is actually how we entered and possessed the land in the first place. That it's not about military strength. It's not about strategy. It's not about technology. It's about obedience. And if they just start practicing obedience while they're in exile, then maybe, just maybe, that will be the key to experiencing God's faithfulness to re-give them the land. Okay, are you tracking? So this is how Deuteronomic theology, Deuteronomic history works. It explains how they got where they're at, but even more, it begins to give them hope that maybe there'll be renewal, maybe there'll be homecoming. Okay, let's think about another story in Joshua. We'll do one more. So Joshua chapter 2 is where we get the story of Rahab. And so if you want to go ahead and turn there, I'll go ahead and start reading. It's a little bit lengthy. I don't know if I'll read the whole thing, but we'll get started with it. So Joshua chapter 2. And Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. And it was told to the king of Jericho, "Behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land." Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, "True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords, and the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord, that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. And the men said to her, our life for yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. Now, this is about their entrance into the land. Joshua sent spies. They stay with Rahab. Rahab shelters them, protects them, and then is going to send them on their way safely. Who's reading this story, and what do they need to hear? The exiles are the ones hearing about it. They're the ones reading about it. And what are they hearing? Did you hear what Rahab said? Rahab said that she knows, the whole city knows, that their God is God of heaven above and of earth below, and that their God is giving them the land. Now that's good news to the exiles. That here is this Canaanite prostitute woman, and she knows that their God is the true God. She knows that their God is giving them this land. And so she's going to be loyal to their God rather than to her own king and her own people. She knows whose land it really belongs to. That their God is God of heaven above and of earth below, and that Jericho is God's to give, and he's given it to the Israelites. She has incredible faith. You might even say that her faith is greater than that of the spies. Who needs their faith encouraged? The exiles. And so I think the exiles are hearing in Rahab's voice that, wow, our God is God of heaven above and of earth below. Our God, not the Babylonian gods, but our God is a God of heaven and earth, and that the promised land is God's to give. And so Rahab isn't just encouraging the spies and making a deal for her life. Rahab is actually encouraging the exiles and giving them hope that, no, their God is the supreme God, the superior God, the sovereign God, and the land is God's to give as well as to take, but also to give back. Okay, so that's how I want you to begin to think about these stories. You're thinking about the events going on around 1240 or so with Joshua and that his book narrates. So you're kind of putting yourself in their shoes and thinking about Rahab and kind of the predicament that she's in and who she's going to be loyal to and what she knows. You're thinking about the spies. So you're thinking about the events in the time period, but then you're also thinking about the exiles who have lost, the throne. They've lost the temple. They've lost their turf. What are they hearing in this? Why tell them this story of all the stories that could be told? And I think they needed to hear Rahab's encouraging testimony that she knows that their God really is God and that the earth belongs to this God, and Jericho, the promised land, it's God's to give. Okay, so that's Joshua. You can read on through Joshua. You know that it tells the story of the conquest and then the entrance into the land, the conquest of the land, the dividing the land up, and then they recovenant at the end of Joshua's life.